So, have you ever actually stopped to wonder why some populations absolutely explode while others are rapidly shrinking? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to enthusiastically explore how human reproduction isn't just a simple matter of biology. Actually, it's a highly engineered outcome of social structures. I want you to imagine society as a giant, complex control panel equipped with exactly 11 specific dials. And get this, every single culture on Earth is constantly turning these dials, whether they realize it or not, to engineer their population size. It's an absolutely fascinating system, and we're going to break the whole shebang down today.
Okay, let's dive right into this foundational demographic framework. We're drawing directly from a seriously game-changing paper published by sociologists Kingsley Davis and Judith Blake in the journal Economic Development and Cultural Change. This paper literally revolutionized the field by giving us a rigorous analytical structure to see exactly how societies organize themselves to either boost or suppress human fertility.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the analytic framework, look at the plus and minus scoreboard, and then dive into specific variables like the age of unions, permanent celibacy, contraception, and fecundity.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the analytic framework.
We need to begin by addressing a massive paradox that Davis and Blake noticed. Why do underdeveloped pre-industrial areas with high mortality rates have booming, highly fertile populations, while resource-rich, highly advanced industrial societies shrink or stabilize? It's kind of counterintuitive, right? Well, to solve this demographic puzzle, we have to distinguish between two things: conditioning variables and intermediate variables. Now, conditioning variables are your broad cultural factors. We're talking religion, economics, or education. But here's the catch: they are completely powerless on their own. They can only influence fertility by operating strictly through 11 specific biological and behavioral mechanisms. And those 11 mechanisms? Those are the intermediate variables. If a cultural norm wants to change the birth rate, it absolutely must press one of these 11 intermediate buttons.
To organize this, the authors systematically grouped these 11 intermediate variables under the three non-negotiable chronological steps of human reproduction: intercourse, conception, and gestation. You can think of this as a strict three-step checkpoint system. First, you have the intercourse variables, which dictate exposure to sex, things like the age you enter a union. Second, if that checkpoint is passed, you hit the conception variables, which dictate exposure to pregnancy, like using contraception. And third, the gestation variables, which govern a successful birth. Every single cultural influence on fertility has to pass sequentially through this exact biological checkpoint system.
All right, moving on to the plus and minus values.
Now that we've got our 11 dials, we really need to understand how these variables act as a mathematical scoreboard for a society's growth. Because every single variable is present in every single society, without exception, and each of these 11 variables carries either a plus or minus fertility value. So, a plus value means the society's behavior on that specific dial enhances or maximizes fertility. For instance, a culture that uses absolutely no birth control has a strong plus value on that dial. A minus value, on the other hand, means the behavior depresses fertility, like successfully using contraception. The actual real-world birth rate of any nation is simply the net balance of all 11 dials turning together. Pretty elegant, isn't it?
Let's look closely at variable 1, age of entry into unions.
So, examining the very first dial on our control panel, which is an intercourse variable, we explicitly use the term sexual union. Why not just say marriage? Because we must account for any heterosexual relationship where intercourse actually occurs. If we only looked at legal marriage, we'd miss the reality of human reproduction entirely. This specific term strictly distinguishes between fully approved marriages and strongly proscribed illegitimate unions, capturing all of them, so our demographic math remains perfectly tied to the biology.
Under their heading, Institutional Patterns in the Intermediate Variables, a Preliminary Analysis, the authors contrast how pre-industrial and urban industrial societies arrive at totally different outcomes. In pre-industrial societies, you often see a joint household with patrolocal residence. That means a son marries and brings his new wife straight into his father's home. Because the clan's property isn't divided up, the young couple doesn't need to be financially independent to marry. This leads to very early marriages and a massive plus fertility value. Now, contrast this with industrial or Western societies. They favor the independent, nuclear family and neolocal residence, meaning a newlywed couple must establish a brand new, separate home. This system emphasizes marital rather than filial solidarity. And because the couple must be economically self-sufficient to start that new home, they are literally forced to wait, delaying marriage and creating a strong minus fertility value.
This economic reality is brilliantly illustrated by the historic practice of impartible inheritance in places like northwestern Europe. This meant a farm or estate could not be chopped up into smaller pieces. It was passed down whole, often through primogeniture, meaning it all goes to the oldest son, or ultimogeniture, where it goes to the youngest. But what about the other siblings? Well, the societal rule was ruthless. No holding, no marriage. The siblings who didn't inherit the farm literally could not legally or socially marry until they secured their own land or a trade somewhere else. This structural economic rule naturally depressed the society's fertility by severely delaying the age of union.
Okay, let's turn to variable 2, permanent celibacy.
While postponing marriage lowers fertility, avoiding marriage entirely is an even stronger minus value. And to see how extreme this can get in an urban industrial system, we look at Ireland. Following the devastating potato famine, Irish tenant farmers realized that subdividing their land was basically a path to starvation. So they fiercely adopted impartible inheritance. Only one son got the farm. And because they maintained that independent nuclear family system where you needed land to marry, the others simply couldn't. This resulted in a jaw-dropping demographic shift. An astonishing 26.3% of Irish women aged 45 to 49 in 1946 were still single. Think about that for a second. Over a quarter of women simply traded high fertility for economic survival.
But, this control panel adjustment didn't come with a massive societal cost. Reporting impartially on the historical data, Davis and Blake point out that this strict neolocal system required immense community effort to suppress sexual expression outside of marriage. You had huge chunks of the adult population unable to marry, and society heavily censoring and policing their behavior. This exacted a really heavy psychological toll, which is reflected historically in Ireland's high mental illness rates, with 57% of hospital beds devoted to mental cases in 1949 compared to 49% in the United States.
To prove that widespread society-level permanent celibacy is nearly impossible to maintain without extreme friction, the authors tracked the Roman Catholic Church's grueling struggle just to enforce the rule among a tiny fraction of religious personnel. Starting from a command in 385 AD, through Pope Gregory's edicts in 1074, all the way to the Lateran Council in 1123. It took the Church over 9 centuries just to get monks to stop getting married, which really just goes to show how overwhelmingly strong human biological imperatives are, and why societies generally prefer to rely on delaying marriage rather than trying to ban it altogether.
Next up is variable 8, the use or non-use of contraception. Moving to the conception variables, why do highly fertile pre-industrial societies rarely use contraception, maintaining a massive plus value on this dial? Well, it's not always because they actively want maximum children. Often they simply lack the technological dial to turn. Pre-industrial couples lack reproductive physiological knowledge. Their methods are clumsy, hit-or-miss chemical attempts, relying way more on magic than science. But even more importantly, and this is key, there is a profound social insulation of the sexes. In many traditional cultures, men and women live in entirely separated social spheres. Sex is surrounded by so many taboos that a husband and wife can barely even communicate about intimate matters. And that makes the active cooperation required for effective contraception virtually impossible.
Let's move on to fecundity, unstable unions, and the remaining variables.
Now we've got to round out our societal control panel by looking at what the authors call the other intermediate variables. Take variable 9, voluntary control over fecundity, which essentially means sterilization. Historically, both pre-industrial and industrial societies share a plus value here, simply because safe, harmless sterilization was medically impossible for most of human history. Then there's variable 3a, the time spent between unstable unions. If a society has high divorce rates, it only creates a minus value on fertility if there's a massive time gap before the partners remarry. But what happens when a union ends not in divorce, but in death? This brings us to variable 3b, post-widowhood celibacy. Some cultures enforce widow-agamy, which is basically a strict rule forbidding widows to remarry, permanently turning their fertility dial to a minus. But many pre-industrial societies counter this to keep populations high. They use institutional workarounds like the levirate, where a widow is expected to marry her dead husband's brother, or they utilize classificatory brothers to step in, ensuring the widow keeps reproducing and the dial stays at a plus. We also have variable 4, voluntary abstinence within unions. Some cultures implement sexual fasting for religious rituals, or they mandate long periods of abstinence postpartum, pushing the dial toward a minus. Finally, we have to look at the gestation phase and the darker extremes of demographic control. Variable 11 is voluntary control over fetal mortality, or abortion, practiced in varying degrees throughout history. And while not technically an intermediate variable since it happens after birth, the authors include a crucial section titled A Note on Infanticide. Historically, when the 11 dials just weren't enough to prevent starvation, some societies resorted to brutal post-gestational methods to control population size, most specifically female infanticide, to literally eliminate future reproducers. It's a really stark reminder of the immense life-or-death pressures societies face to balance their numbers.
As we arrive at the conclusion, the general pattern, I want you to just look around at the world today. Consider how the invisible hand of social structure still governs our biology just as strictly now as it did centuries ago. With global birth rates dropping dramatically, which of these 11 hidden dials is driving the demographic shifts we see in our own modern lives? Are we delaying unions due to intense economic pressures? Are we fully mastering variable 8 with modern contraception? The societal control panel is always active, and understanding how it works is absolutely crucial to understanding our future. Thanks for exploring this framework with us.